The wind mourned through the bare branches of ancient oaks surrounding Ashford Manor, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and approaching winter, a melancholy perfume that seemed to seep into the very stones of the grand estate. Inside the cavernous entrance hall, Lady Elara Ashford moved with practiced silence across marble floors that gleamed cold beneath her slippered feet, her arms cradling white chrysanthemums and crimson dahlias she had cut from the greenhouse that morning, flowers that would grace the hall table as they did every week, unnoticed by anyone save herself. The late autumn light filtered weakly through tall windows, casting her shadow long and thin against walls hung with portraits of Ashford ancestors who gazed down with expressions of stern disapproval, as if they too recognized her for what she was, a phantom, a legal necessity, a wife in name alone who had haunted these corridors for 10 years without ever truly inhabiting them. She arranged the blooms with careful precision, her fingers remembering the task even as her mind wandered to the familiar territories of her solitude, thinking how strange it was that one could be married and yet so profoundly alone, legally bound to a man who treated her with the same courteous distance one might afford a visiting dignitary rather than the woman who shared his name. Sebastian Ashford, Duke of Ashford, had not spoken her Christian name since their wedding day, preferring instead the impersonal Duchess or the formal Madam, titles that created walls between them more impenetrable than the separate bedchambers they occupied in the manor's east wing. Their marriage had been a transaction, nothing more her father's crumbling estate, saved from ruin in exchange for her hand, her bloodline, her dutiful presence at social functions, where she smiled and curtsied and played the role of devoted duchess, while her husband stood across crowded ballrooms, his dark eyes never quite meeting hers, his tall frame always angled slightly away, as if even proximity might suggest an intimacy that did not exist. She stepped back to assess the arrangement, adjusting a dahlia that drooped slightly, and caught her reflection in the gilded mirror above the table. A woman of 29 who looked older, her chestnut hair pinned severely back, her grey eyes holding a weariness that came not from hardship, but from the slow erosion of hope, from years of existing as furniture in another person's house, beautiful perhaps but ultimately decorative, serving a purpose but never truly seen. The grandfather clock in the corridor chimed 3, its deep tones echoing through empty rooms, and she knew without looking that Sebastian would be in his study, behind the heavy oak door he kept closed against intrusion, working on estate matters or correspondence, living his life in careful compartments that did not include her. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. The morning ritual had not varied in a decade, a choreography of absence so practiced it required no thought. Elara descended to the breakfast room precisely at 8, knowing she would find only her own place setting arranged at the long mahogany table, the Duke having taken his meal at 7 and retreated to his study, where he would remain until evening, and the household, moving around him like water around stone, while she moved through it like morning mist, present but insubstantial. She ate without appetite, the eggs and toast turning to ash in her mouth, as they always did when consumed in solitude, the silence broken only by the clink of silver against porcelain, and the distant sounds of servants going about their duties in other wings of the manor, lives being lived that did not intersect with hers except in the most superficial ways. After breakfast, she met with Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, to discuss menus and household matters, suggestions Elara made that were received with polite nods and promptly ignored. The older woman, having served the Ashford family for 30 years and seeing no reason to defer to a duchess who held the title but not the authority, who had never been granted the keys to the household despite a decade of marriage. The library became her refuge in the afternoon hours, a room of leather and old paper where she could lose herself in novels that spoke of passion and connection, and of marriages built on something more than financial necessity, though she was always aware of Sebastian's presence behind the closed door of his adjacent study, could hear the scratch of his pen, the occasional low murmur of his voice when his man of business called, separated from her by nothing more than wood and plaster, yet utterly unreachable. Dinner brought their only interaction, a painful formality where they sat at opposite ends of the table, an expanse of polished wood between them that might as well have been an ocean, and engaged in conversation so stilted it barely qualified as communication. "I trust you are well, madam," he would inquire, his dark eyes skimming past her face, as if direct eye contact might create an intimacy he could not tolerate. "Quite well, your grace, and yourself?" she would reply, her voice steady despite the way her hands trembled slightly in her lap, a tremor born of proximity to the only man who had ever moved her, who continued to move her despite years of careful distance. They discussed the estate, the weather, upcoming social obligations, their words circling everything that mattered while touching nothing of substance, and she thought how strange it was that two people could share a name, a home, a legal bond recognized by church and state, yet remain such profound strangers to one another. She had hoped once, in those early months and years, that patience might soften him, that her steadfast presence might eventually earn something more than courtesy, but hope was a dangerous companion, and she had learned to lock it away, to protect the tender places of her heart behind walls as impenetrable as his own. When the meal concluded, he would rise, bow slightly, murmur, "Good evening, madam," and withdraw, leaving her to finish her wine alone before climbing the stairs to her chambers in the east wing, walking past his door always closed, always dark beneath the frame, to her own room 20 paces distant, the space between their doors, a physical manifestation of the chasm that defined their marriage, a distance measured not in feet but in years of silence, in words never spoken, and in a loneliness so complete it had become her constant companion, more reliable than any husband could ever be. The memory came to her unbidden as she stood before the wedding portrait in the long gallery, a painting she rarely visited but found herself drawn to on this particular grey afternoon, when the weight of her solitude felt heavier than usual, and there she was, captured in oils 10 years younger, barely 19, with hope still visible in her painted eyes, standing beside Sebastian, who looked exactly as he did now, save for a few silver threads at his temples, both of them frozen in formal poses that captured the essence of their union. Proximity without connection, partnership without warmth. She remembered that day with painful clarity, remembered the church filled with society's elite who had come to witness the merging of two great families, though none present had been fooled into thinking this anything more than what it was, a business transaction dressed in orange blossoms and white silk. Her father had stood in the front pew, his relief so palpable she could feel it even through her veil, the weight of his debts lifted by her sacrifice, his estate saved by her agreement to become the Duchess of Ashford. And she had not begrudged him this salvation, even as she spoke vows to a man whose dark eyes remained fixed somewhere over her shoulder, who placed the ring on her finger with the clinical precision of a solicitor executing a contract. Sebastian had been 28 then, already hardened by whatever forces shaped him into the remote figure he remained, his tall frame rigid in his wedding clothes, his expression betraying nothing as they were pronounced man and wife before God and witnesses, and when he had kissed her their first and for many years only kiss, his lips had barely grazed hers, a perfunctory gesture that fulfilled obligation while maintaining the careful distance that would define their marriage. The words he spoke to her after the ceremony, in the brief moment of privacy before they faced the wedding breakfast, had carved themselves into her memory with the permanence of stone. "This is a practical arrangement. Miss Hartley, I beg your pardon, Your Grace. I require an heir and a hostess to maintain my household and position in society. You require financial security for yourself and your family. These are the terms upon which we have agreed. Let us maintain appropriate boundaries and execute our duties with the dignity befitting our stations." She had stood there in her wedding gown, still holding her bouquet of white roses, feeling something inside her crystallize into resignation, the romantic dreams of her girlhood dying in the face of his cold pragmatism. Though she had managed to nod and murmur her agreement, because what else could she do, bound as she now was by law and church, and the debts her acceptance had erased. Now, a decade later, she reached out and touched the gilded frame where their painted hands almost met, the artist having taken liberties with reality to create the illusion of a couple united, and she thought how appropriate that even in this permanent rendering of their union, they did not quite touch. The space between their hands, a gap that had never closed, a distance measured not in inches, but in years of silence, and separate bedrooms and dinners consumed at opposite ends of 2 long tables, and she wondered, not for the first time, if he ever looked at this portrait and felt anything at all, or if she had simply become another piece of furniture in his grand house, noticed only when absent, valued only for function, loved not at all. Weeks passed with the steady rhythm of changing seasons, winter's harshness giving way to the tentative promise of early spring. And during this time, Elara began to notice things she told herself were meaningless, coincidences that her lonely heart inflated into significance, though she knew better than to trust such observations after a decade of careful disappointment. She would descend the staircase in the morning and catch his hand, pausing on the banister, when her laugh echoed from the servants' corridor, where she had shared some small jest with young Mary the housemaid, his dark head turning slightly as if to locate the source of that sound before he continued on his way without acknowledgement, and she thought it nothing until it happened again, and then again, until the pattern became undeniable even as she denied it to herself. At the dinner party they hosted for Lord and Lady Pemberton and a dozen other members of the county's elite. She felt his eyes on her as she moved through the ballroom, ensuring guests were attended to, his gaze following her progress from the refreshment table to the card room to the terrace where the gentlemen smoked. And when she glanced his way, she found him looking elsewhere, but something in his posture betrayed that his attention had only just shifted, the way a person stands when caught in observation they did not wish acknowledged. The most peculiar moment came late one evening when she retired to her chambers, following the same path she had walked for 10 years, and she heard his footsteps behind her in the corridor, heavier than usual, deliberate. And when she reached her door and glanced back, she saw him standing at his own entrance, 20 paces distant, his hand on the handle, but his body turned slightly toward her, and his expression, in the dim lamplight, unreadable but intense. And for a full minute they stood thus suspended in the hallway's shadows before he gave a slight nod and disappeared into his room, leaving her standing there with her heart pounding for reasons she could not name, or would not name for fear of being wrong. Asterisk, you are imagining things. Asterisk, she told herself firmly as she prepared for bed that night. Asterisk, 10 years of loneliness can make one see what isn't there, can transform courtesy into tenderness and coincidence into meaning. Asterisk. But the observations continued, small accumulations that built like snowfall, individually insignificant but collectively impossible to ignore, and one afternoon she sat at the pianoforte in the music room, a space she favored for its eastern light and its distance from Sebastian's study, playing a Chopin nocturne she had learned as a girl, her fingers finding the melancholy melody with ease born of repetition, and she was so lost in the music that she did not see the shadow that fell across the hallway outside, did not know that Sebastian stood there in the darkened corridor, listening with an expression on his face that would have stopped her heart had she witnessed it, a look of such naked longing and regret that it transformed his normally stern features into something vulnerable, almost broken. He had been walking past, intending to review the steward's reports in the library, when the music reached him, her music, played with a grace and feeling that spoke of inner depths he had deliberately ignored for a decade, and he found himself unable to move, unable to do anything but stand there and listen, while something in his chest tightened painfully. Asterisk, I have denied myself this. Asterisk, he thought. Asterisk denied us both this. And for what? For pride? For fear? For adherence to boundaries I myself imposed because I was too much a coward to risk vulnerability? Asterisk. The attraction he had felt from their wedding day, perhaps even before, an attraction he had ruthlessly suppressed beneath layers of duty and propriety, and the lessons his cold father had taught him about the dangers of showing one's heart, surged through him now with such force that he had to brace himself against the doorframe, and he knew in that moment that he could not continue this way, that something would have to give, though the fear that had governed him for so long still held him frozen in that hallway, listening to his wife play music that spoke of everything they were not to each other, while his hands clenched at his sides with the effort of not going to her, not crossing that threshold and disrupting the careful distance that had defined their marriage, not risking the rejection he was certain would come if she knew the true depth of his regard. And so he stood there in the shadows until the last notes faded into silence, then turned and walked away before she could discover him there, a coward still despite his moment of revelation. The storm came without warning on an afternoon in late April, when the air had grown thick with the promise of rain and the sky darkened to pewter, clouds rolling across the estate with the swiftness that characterized spring weather in the English countryside, and Elara had sought refuge in the library, as she often did when the weather turned, settling into the window seat with a volume of poetry she had been meaning to read, the French doors to the conservatory standing open to admit what little light remained in the gloom. She was deep in a particular verse about longing and distance when the first crack of thunder shook the house, so violent that the windows rattled in their frames, and she looked up to see the trees beyond the glass, bending nearly horizontal under the force of wind that had risen from nowhere, the leaves and small branches torn free and sent spinning through the air like debris from some great explosion. And she stood quickly, moved to close the conservatory doors before the rain came, but she had barely reached them when she heard it, a sound like the world splitting open, a tremendous groaning crack followed by the shriek of wood surrendering to forces beyond its capacity to resist. The ancient elm that had stood sentinel beside the conservatory for longer than the house itself gave way, its massive trunk splintering as the wind caught it at precisely the wrong angle, and Elara stood frozen in the doorway, watching it fall, watching tons of wood and branch arcing toward the glass structure with the terrible inevitability of disaster, time seeming to slow even as everything accelerated, and she knew with crystalline clarity that she should move, should run, but her body refused to obey, rooted to the spot by shock or fear or simple disbelief that this was happening. Then hands gripped her arms, strong and urgent, and she was pulled backward with such force that she stumbled, would have fallen if not for the body behind her, solid and protective, and she heard Sebastian's voice close to her ear saying, "Get down," as he turned her away from the windows, his arms coming around her to shield her with his own body, as the world exploded into chaos, glass shattering in a cascade of crystalline destruction, the tree crashing through the conservatory's delicate framework, with the sound of a building collapsing, rain suddenly pouring through the violated structure to drench everything within reach. They stood there, pressed together in the library doorway, his arms locked around her, her face against his chest where she could feel the rapid hammering of his heart, both of them breathing hard from shock and the nearness of catastrophe. And for a long moment neither moved, the rain and wind howling through the ruined conservatory while they remained in their protective embrace, and Elara became aware of every point where their bodies touched, the warmth of his hands on her back, the strength in the arms that held her, the way he bent over her as if he could make himself a wall between her and harm. When she finally lifted her head to look at him, she found his face mere inches from hers, his dark eyes searching her features with an intensity that stole what little breath she had regained, and his right hand came up almost of its own volition to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing across her skin with a tenderness so at odds with the violence of the storm that she felt tears prick her eyes, and she saw something in his expression shift, something that looked like words he wanted to speak, confessions he needed to make. But then voices echoed in the corridor, the servants drawn by the crash, running to investigate, and his hand fell away. His arms released her, and he stepped back with visible effort, the formal mask descending over his features, even as his eyes betrayed that the distance cost him something. "Mrs." Hartwell burst into the library with 3 footmen behind her, all of them exclaiming over the destruction, asking if her grace was harmed, if his grace required anything, their presence filling the space that had held only the 2 of them and whatever had passed between them in those suspended moments. And Sebastian turned to direct the servants, his voice steady and authoritative as he issued instructions about securing the damaged conservatory and ensuring no one ventured near until the structure could be assessed for safety, and Elara stood there with her heart still racing, her hand unconsciously rising to touch her cheek where his thumb had traced that single, devastating caress, watching him resume command of his household while the rain poured through the broken glass behind them. That night she lay sleepless in her chamber, her hand tingling where it had rested against his chest, feeling the ghost of his arms around her, his breath against her hair, and she thought times, perhaps I imagined it, perhaps the storm made everything seem more significant than it was. 10 years of loneliness can make one see what isn't there, asterisk. But even as she told herself this, she knew it for the lie it was, knew that something had cracked open between them, as surely as that tree had split the conservatory, and whether that opening would lead to healing or further hurt remained to be seen. But she could no longer pretend that nothing existed beneath his careful distance, could no longer deny that she had felt something real in those moments when he held her as if she were precious, as if losing her would have destroyed him, and the knowledge kept her wakeful until dawn painted the sky beyond her windows in shades of rose and gold. The storm passed, but its effects lingering in ways that had nothing to do with broken glass and fallen trees. The weeks that followed the storm brought changes so subtle that Elara might have missed them had she not been watching for them with the desperate attention of someone who has been starved and suddenly catches the scent of sustenance. And the first shift came during a discussion of the tenant cottages, when Sebastian sought her out in the morning room where she was reviewing the household accounts, asking not merely as a formality but with genuine interest what she thought about expanding the workers' housing near the South Fields. And when she offered her opinion that the families there needed better access to the well and perhaps a small schoolhouse for the children, he listened with his full attention, nodding slowly, as if weighing her words with the same seriousness he gave to his steward's reports. And 2 days later, she learned he had commissioned plans for exactly what she had suggested, crediting her insight when he discussed it with the estate manager. Books began appearing in the library, volumes she had mentioned wanting to read in passing conversations she had not realized he was listening to, first editions of poetry and the latest novels from London, and when she asked Mrs. Hartwell about them, the housekeeper merely smiled and said His Grace had ordered them specially, and Elara would run her fingers over the leather bindings, wondering what it meant that he had remembered her casual remarks about literature when he had seemed not to hear anything she said for 10 years. The most startling development came during afternoon tea, a ritual she had long ago resigned herself to taking alone in the drawing room, while Sebastian remained sequestered in his study. But one Thursday in late May, he appeared in the doorway at precisely 4 o'clock and asked if he might join her, and she nearly dropped the teapot in her shock before gathering herself enough to gesture to the chair across from hers, and they sat there in awkward silence for several minutes before he asked about her correspondence with her sister, actually asked follow-up questions about Caroline's children and her husband's political ambitions, and when Elara made a wry observation about the absurdity of parliamentary procedures, he did something she had never seen in their entire marriage. He smiled. Not the formal upturn of lips he deployed at social functions, but a genuine expression of amusement that reached his eyes and transformed his severe features into something almost boyish, and the sight of it made her heart perform an uncomfortable acrobatic feat in her chest. The servants noticed, of course they noticed, and Elara caught the meaningful glances exchanged between Mrs. Hartwell and Jenkins, the butler, when Sebastian lingered over breakfast instead of rushing to his study, saw the way the footmen tried to hide their smiles when His Grace actually laughed at something Her Grace said about the vicar's interminable sermons, heard the whispered conversations that ceased abruptly when she entered rooms, and she knew the entire household was watching this strange courtship between two people who had been married for a decade. But even as hope began to uncurl in her chest, like a flower seeking sun, after a long winter, she kept her guard in place, remembering too well the pain of disappointed expectations, thinking times, I cannot let myself believe this is real. I cannot risk my heart again when it has taken so long to build these protective walls. Yet, finding those walls increasingly difficult to maintain when he looked at her with such attention, such focus, as if she were a text. He was finally learning to read after years of believing he knew its contents without opening the cover, and she was caught between the fear of being hurt again and the terrible, dangerous possibility that perhaps after all these years something genuine might be growing between them, though whether it would be enough to heal the wounds of a decade's neglect remained a question she could not yet answer, even as she found herself watching for him in the mornings, listening for his footsteps in the corridors, her treacherous heart hoping, despite her mind's warnings, that this time the spring thaw might actually lead to summer warmth instead of another retreat into winter's isolation. The rose garden had become Elara's sanctuary over the years, a place where she could lose herself in the careful tending of something beautiful, and on a morning in early June, when the air hung heavy with the scent of blooms in their full glory, she knelt among the bushes with her gardening shears and basket, pruning away spent flowers and training new growth along the trellises, her gloves already stained green from the work, and she was so absorbed in coaxing a particularly stubborn climber into place that she did not hear the footsteps on the gravel path until his shadow fell across the rose bed, and she looked up to find Sebastian standing there with his hands clasped behind his back, watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher, something between uncertainty and determination, and for a moment neither spoke, the silence broken only by birdsong and the distant sound of the gardeners working in the kitchen garden beyond the hedge. He cleared his throat, the formal gesture at odds with the way his fingers tightened where they were clasped, and asked with careful politeness if he might walk with her through the gardens. And though her heart immediately began that traitorous acceleration she had come to associate with his presence, she kept her voice steady as she rose, brushing dirt from her skirts and setting aside her basket, gesturing toward the path that wound through her carefully cultivated domain. They walked in silence at first, past beds of lavender that released their perfume with each brush of their clothing, around the fountain where water trickled over moss-covered stone, beneath the arbor heavy with wisteria that created a tunnel of purple blooms, and he remarked on the weather with the kind of banality reserved for distant acquaintances, mentioned some business with the tenants that required attention, asked after her correspondence with her sister, as if they were not walking through a space she had created from loneliness and neglect, as if every rose bush did not represent hours she had spent alone while he remained locked in his study. And she responded with equal formality, her answers polite and revealing nothing, until finally an uncomfortable silence fell between them that even the beauty surrounding them could not soften. And it was he who broke it, stopping beside a particularly magnificent specimen of deep crimson roses, touching one bloom with careful fingers as if afraid it might shatter under his attention. "These gardens have flourished under your care," he said, and though the words were simple, something in his tone made them feel weighted with meaning, as if he were saying something more than the obvious observation. And Elara felt her throat tighten, because in 10 years of marriage he had never once commented on her efforts here, had never acknowledged this space she had poured herself into during all those solitary afternoons, and she looked at him carefully before responding, her words chosen with precision. "I have had much time to devote to them," and the subtext hung in the air between them, heavy as the rose scent, the unspoken truth that she had time because she had nothing else, no one else, long hours that stretched empty and aching, that she filled with soil and thorns, and the patient work of making something grow where he had planted only distance. She saw his jaw tighten, saw something flash in his eyes that might have been pain or regret or both, and he seemed on the verge of speaking, his lips parting as if words were gathering there that had been locked away too long, when Jenkins appeared at the garden gate, calling that Lord Pemberton had arrived unexpectedly and was waiting in the drawing-room, and the moment shattered like glass. Whatever Sebastian had been about to say swallowed back as duty reasserted itself, and he offered her a slight bow, formal and cold, as if the past months of tentative connection had never happened, before turning to stride back toward the house with that decisive walk that left no room for protest. And Elara stood alone among her roses, with her heart beating too fast, and her hands trembling slightly as she touched the crimson bloom he had caressed, thinking that she had been a fool to hope that a single compliment after a decade of silence could mean anything real, yet unable to forget the way his voice had softened when he spoke of the gardens flourishing, as if he wished he could say the same of her, as if he knew exactly how much time she had spent here, alone, and regretted every moment of it. And she remained there long after he had gone, surrounded by the beauty she had cultivated from emptiness, wondering whether she had the strength to keep hoping, or whether it would be wiser to tend only her roses and accept that some things, once neglected too long, could never truly bloom. The Marlborough Ball arrived with the heavy inevitability of summer thunder, and Elara found herself standing in the grand ballroom surrounded by glittering chandeliers and the rustle of silk gowns, while Sebastian stood across the room, engaged in conversation with Lord Wessex and several other gentlemen, his posture as rigid and formal as always, as if the past months of tentative connection had been nothing more than her imagination, and she felt the familiar ache of invisibility settling over her shoulders like a cloak she had worn too long to ever truly shed, until Baron Frederick Ashton approached with that charming smile that had won over half the mothers in London society, and asked if she would honor him with a dance. And something reckless stirred in her chest, a defiance born of too many years spent waiting for a husband who would not see her, so she accepted his hand and let him lead her onto the floor, where they moved through a waltz with an ease that surprised her, and he made her laugh with his witty observations about the other guests, genuine laughter that bubbled up from a place she had forgotten existed. And when the music ended, he did not release her hand, but instead requested another dance, and then another, and his attention so focused and flattering that she almost forgot to guard herself against the pleasure of being noticed, of being seen as something other than a ghost, haunting the corridors of her own home. She did not see Sebastian watching from his position near the windows, did not notice how his knuckles whitened where his hand gripped his glass, how his jaw tightened with each turn she made in the Baron's arms, how his eyes tracked her movement across the floor with an intensity that made Lord Wessex pause mid-sentence and follow his gaze with raised eyebrows. And when Baron Ashton suggested during their third dance that perhaps they might take some air in the garden, that the ballroom had grown rather warm, and he had heard the Marlborough roses were particularly fine this year, Elara hesitated only a moment before nodding, thinking, "Times, why should I not accept kindness where it is offered, when my own husband treats me as furniture **." But before they could move toward the terrace doors, Sebastian materialized at her elbow with such sudden force that both she and the Baron stepped back in surprise, and his Grace's voice was cold as January frost when he informed Baron Ashton that the Duchess had a prior engagement, that he required her presence for introductions to several important guests, his hand closing around her arm with a possessiveness that was entirely new and shocking in its barely controlled intensity, and the Baron, reading the dangerous glint in the Duke's eyes with the wisdom of a man who knew when to retreat, bowed gracefully and withdrew, leaving Elara standing beside her husband, with her heart pounding and confusion, warring with a strange exhilaration, because this was jealousy, unmistakable and raw, breaking through his carefully maintained facade like spring water through winter ice. The carriage ride home was thick with silence, a charged atmosphere that made the enclosed space feel suffocating, and Elara sat as far from Sebastian as the seat would allow, watching his profile in the darkness, seeing the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched into fists on his thighs, the muscle jumping in his jaw as if he were physically restraining himself from speaking, and the silence stretched between them like a bridge. Neither knew how to cross until finally she could bear it no longer, and her voice cut through the darkness sharp with confusion and a decade of accumulated hurt. "You have never cared before how I spent my time, with whom I danced, with whom I conversed. You have treated me as if I were merely another piece of estate property to be managed from a distance. So pray tell me, Your Grace, what has changed that you suddenly find my activities worthy of your notice?" And the words hung in the air between them, a challenge and an accusation and a plea all at once, and for a long moment she thought he would not answer, would retreat behind that impenetrable wall of ducal dignity. But then his voice came low and rough, with an emotion she could not name. "I have always cared," and those 4 words fell between them like stones into still water, sending ripples through everything she thought she understood, and then silence again, the kind of silence that screams louder than any words. And when the carriage finally pulled up to Ashford Manor, they descended without speaking, and entered the house like strangers, and Elara climbed the stairs to her chamber, with her mind churning through everything that had happened: the dancing, the almost escape to the garden, Sebastian's intervention, and his confession that he had always cared, and she stood at her window looking out over the darkened grounds, thinking that caring and loving were not the same thing, that caring could be dutiful and distant, while what she needed was something fiercer, something brave enough to break through the years of silence and say her name with tenderness, and she wondered whether his jealousy tonight had been merely possessiveness over what he considered his, or whether beneath it lay something deeper, something that might finally bridge the chasm between their separate chambers and their separate lives, though she feared hoping was the most dangerous thing she could do after so many years of learning not to. Sebastian sat alone in his study long after midnight, the fire burning low in the grate while shadows danced across the oak-panelled walls, and he held a glass of brandy. He had no intention of drinking because what he needed was clarity, not oblivion, and clarity meant confronting the truth. He had spent 10 years avoiding with every carefully maintained wall and every formal address, and every night he had stood outside her chamber door, listening to the rustle of her movements within, before forcing himself to walk away to his own cold bed. And the truth was this: he had loved her, almost from the beginning. From those early months when he had told himself his interest was merely aesthetic appreciation for her grace, from the first time he had heard her laugh with genuine joy at something one of the maids had said, and felt his chest constrict with a longing so fierce it terrified him, From the morning he had found her in the library, absorbed in a volume of philosophy with such concentration that she had not heard him enter, and he had stood, watching the way. Sunlight streaming through the windows turned her hair to gold, and thinking that he had married a woman whose depth he would never deserve to plumb, because he was too much a coward to try. His father's voice echoed in his memory, cold and dismissive. "Affection is a weakness, Sebastian, something for poets and fools. A duke must never allow his heart to compromise his judgment, and his mother had lived and died proving that lesson. A woman who had loved his father desperately, while the old duke treated her with the same polite distance." Sebastian now recognized in his own behavior toward Elara, and he had watched his mother wither like a flower denied sunlight, had sworn as a boy never to inflict such pain on another, nor to open himself to receiving it. But duty demanded he marry and produce an heir, so he had chosen the most practical arrangement possible, telling himself that clear boundaries would protect them both from the messy complications of emotion, never imagining that Elara's quiet dignity would slip past every defense he erected, that her kindness to the servants would reveal a generous heart he found himself craving to know, that her intelligence in those rare conversations they shared would leave him hungry for more, that the patient way she endured his coldness would shame him more than any recrimination could have done. He thought of specific moments that had accumulated like water drops wearing away stone. The afternoon, he had seen her reading to old Mrs. Henderson from the village, her voice gentle and her attention complete, as if nothing else in the world mattered. The evening at the Pemberton ball when she had made a witty observation about the ambassador's pomposity, and he had nearly smiled before catching himself. The morning after the storm when her hand had rested in his for those few precious seconds, and he had felt the warmth of her skin through her glove and known he was lost. Tonight, watching her laugh in Baron Ashton's arms, feeling jealousy tear through him with such violence that all his careful control had shattered, and he had claimed her in front of half of London society like some primitive creature marking territory, and he had seen the confusion in her eyes during the carriage ride home, had heard the hurt beneath her anger when she confronted him, and he had managed only those 4 words, "I have always cared," when what he should have said was, "I have always loved you. I have been loving you in silence while you suffered loneliness I created. I have been a coward protecting my own heart while breaking yours." But the words had stuck in his throat, because speaking them meant admitting 10 years of failure, 10 years of causing pain to the woman he loved, because he was too afraid of the vulnerability that love demanded. And now he sat in the darkness thinking, "Times I have been a coward, protecting myself while causing her pain asterisk." And he knew that tomorrow or the next day or whenever courage finally overcame fear, he would have to find a way to tell her the truth, though he suspected the truth might come too late, that 10 years of distance could not be bridged by a few months of tentative attention and 1 night of jealous possession. And yet he could not continue as they had been, could not spend another decade watching her move through Ashford Manor like a ghost, while he pretended not to notice how beautiful she was, how kind, how utterly wasted on a husband who had never had the courage to say her name with the tenderness it deserved. The fever came upon Elara 3 days after the Marlborough ball, beginning as a slight headache she dismissed while arranging flowers in the morning room, progressing to chills by afternoon tea, and by evening she could barely stand as her maid helped her to bed while Mrs. Peterson sent for the physician with urgent haste. And by the time Dr. Hartwell arrived, Elara was burning with fever, her skin flushed and hot to the touch, her breathing shallow and rapid, and he prescribed cold compresses and laudanum while speaking in low tones to the housekeeper about the seriousness of her condition. And when Sebastian was informed, he appeared in her doorway still dressed for dinner, his face going pale at the sight of her small form lost in the large bed, her hair spread across the pillow dark with sweat, and he dismissed the maid with a curt gesture and took up position in the chair beside her bed with the grim determination of a soldier manning a post he would not abandon, and for 3 days he did not leave that chair except to pace the floor, when anxiety made stillness impossible, refusing food, barely sleeping, waving away the physician's assurances that these things often ran their course, and that her grace was young and strong. Because Sebastian could see how fragile she looked, or how the fever consumed her until she seemed almost translucent, and he held her hand through the long nights, while she drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling out names he did not recognize, sometimes weeping for reasons he could not fathom, and in those dark hours when he thought he might lose her, he whispered everything he had never had, the courage to say aloud, told her sleeping form that he loved her, and that he had always loved her, that he had been a fool and a coward, that if she would only open her eyes he would spend the rest of his life proving his devotion, that he would call her Elara every day, and that he would never again hide behind formality and distance, that she was the light in his cold house, and he had been too blind to see it, until the thought of losing that light made him understand what darkness truly meant, and Mrs. Peterson found him one morning slumped over the bed with his head resting on the mattress near Elara's hand, unshaven and dishevelled in a way no one at Ashford Manor had ever witnessed, the great Duke reduced to a man terrified of loss, and on the fourth morning when dawn broke pale and silver through the windows, Elara's fever finally broke, the terrible heat leaving her body as suddenly as it had come, and her eyelids fluttered open to see Sebastian still there beside her bed, his hand clasping hers, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and fear, and their gazes met and held, and in that moment something fundamental shifted between them, some wall crumbling that had stood for 10 years, and she saw in his ravaged face a depth of feeling that took her breath away, saw evidence of vigil and devotion that spoke louder than any words could have done, and she whispered, "Sebastian," in a voice raw from fever, and he brought her hand to his lips, his eyes closing as if in prayer. But before either could speak the words that hovered in the charged air between them, Dr. Hartwell bustled in with his cheerful pronouncement that the worst had passed, and Sebastian released her hand and stood, his expression shuttering closed again, though not before she glimpsed the emotion there, and he withdrew from the room with a formal bow while she lay watching him go, wondering if what she had seen in his face was real or merely fever dreams, though the warmth of his hand lingered on hers like a promise yet to be spoken. Elara's recovery was slow and measured, each day bringing slightly more strength to limbs that had felt like water during the fever's grip, and Sebastian appeared at her chamber door every afternoon at precisely 3 o'clock, with an unprecedented regularity that would have been comical had it not been so carefully controlled, so deliberately formal despite the intimacy of finding him unshaven and desperate at her bedside when she had first opened her eyes, and he would enter with a small bow and inquire after her health in that distant ducal tone she knew so well, then settle into the chair, that same chair where he had kept vigil, and read aloud from whatever volume he had selected from the library, his voice steady and melodious as he worked through poetry and philosophy and novels. She suspected he chose specifically for her taste, and she would lie against her pillows watching his profile as he read, searching for some evidence of the raw emotion she had glimpsed in that dawn moment, some crack in the formal facade he had reconstructed so thoroughly, but he never met her eyes for more than a brief second, never allowed his hand to brush hers when he set down the teacup Mrs. Peterson brought, never referenced the 3 days and nights he had spent whispering confessions to her unconscious form, and Elara found herself caught between gratitude for his attentiveness and frustration at his retreat, between the warmth of having him present in her rooms daily for the first time in their marriage, and the coldness of having him present yet still somehow absent, still hiding behind the formal address of Duchess and Madam, when she knew that he had called her Elara in those fever-dark hours, had held her hand as if it were his anchor to sanity, had revealed depths of feeling that now seemed to have vanished like morning mist, and she was still too weak to push, too exhausted to demand the honesty that hovered between them, unspoken, so she simply listened to his reading and watched him, and thought, "Times I cannot continue this way. I cannot spend another 10 years in this half-life, where tenderness appears and disappears like sunlight through clouds, where I am cherished in crisis but invisible in calm. I must either break through these walls or truly let go asterisk," and she decided with the clarity that sometimes comes in convalescence, that when her strength fully returned, she would demand truth, would force the conversation he seemed determined to avoid, would ask plainly what he wanted from this marriage, because she deserved honesty, even if the answer broke her heart. And one afternoon, as he read from Wordsworth about daffodils and solitude, she interrupted him mid-stanza and said, "Sebastian," just to watch him startle at her use of his Christian name, just to see his eyes finally meet hers with something like alarm, and she said, "Thank you for staying with me during the fever. Mrs. Peterson told me you never left." And he went very still, his hand tightening on the book, and for a moment she thought he might finally speak the words that lived in the charged silence between them. But instead he simply nodded once and said, "It was my duty as your husband," in a voice that betrayed nothing, and she turned her face toward the window so he would not see the tears that suddenly burned behind her eyes, would not know how much those cold words cost her after hoping for so much more. 3 weeks after that afternoon, when Sebastian had called his vigil mere duty, Elara rose from her bed with legs that finally felt steady beneath her, dressed herself in a gown of deep burgundy that brought color to cheeks still pale from illness, and walked through the corridors of Ashford Manor with a resolve that had been building through long hours of convalescence and longer hours of thought, and she arrived at Sebastian's study door in the mid-morning when she knew he would be reviewing correspondence, and she knocked once sharp and decisive and entered without waiting for permission, closing the door behind her with a soft click that somehow echoed through the book-lined room like a gunshot, and Sebastian looked up from his desk with surprise evident in the widening of his eyes, because in 10 years of marriage she had never entered his private study uninvited, had never breached this particular sanctuary of his carefully constructed distance, and he rose immediately with ingrained courtesy and said, "Duchess, you should not be out of bed, doctor." Hartwell said, "You require more rest," but she raised one hand to silence him and moved to stand before his desk with her spine straight and her chin lifted in a way that reminded him suddenly of the girl she had been on their wedding day before resignation had taught her to make herself small and unobtrusive, and she said in a voice that trembled only slightly, "Your Grace, we have been married 10 years," and she watched his jaw tighten at her use of his formal title, watched him recognize that she was throwing his own formality back at him like a gauntlet, and she continued, "In that time you have never called me by my name. You have maintained absolute distance even as you share my home and my title and my life, and yet recent weeks have suggested something different. Your vigil during my illness, your daily visits, your reading, to me, as though I was someone you actually cared to spend time with, and I cannot continue in this state of uncertainty. I cannot live in this half-existence where tenderness appears and vanishes like morning fog, where I am cherished in crisis but invisible in calm, where I do not know if you stayed by my bedside out of duty or devotion or something else entirely." And her voice grew stronger as she spoke, 10 years of silence finding its voice at last. And she said, "I deserve honesty," Sebastian, using his Christian name deliberately, watching him flinch as though she had struck him. And she finished, "What do you want from this marriage?" And the question hung in the air between them like something living and dangerous. And Sebastian stood frozen behind his desk, with his hands gripping the edge of the mahogany surface so tightly his knuckles showed white, and she could see him struggling with some internal battle, could see the careful walls he had constructed around himself beginning to crack under the weight of her direct confrontation, and for a long moment he said nothing, while the clock on the mantel ticked away, seconds that felt like hours, and then his mouth opened as though to speak, but no words emerged. And she waited with her heart pounding so hard she thought he must surely hear it, waited for him to finally tell her the truth that would either break her heart completely or begin to mend it. Sebastian stood frozen for a moment longer, then moved with sudden decision away from his desk toward the tall windows that overlooked the east gardens, where morning light spilled across manicured lawns, still wet with dew, and he turned his back to her because it was easier to speak without her eyes upon him, easier to crack open the armor he had worn for so long if he did not have to witness her reaction to each painful revelation, and his voice when it came was lower than usual, rougher, as though the words themselves scraped against his throat on their way out, and he said, "My father was the 4th Duke of Ashford, a man of impeccable reputation and absolute coldness, and he taught me from the time I could understand language that emotion was weakness, that a duke must never show vulnerability. That sentiment was for lesser men who had the luxury of insignificance," and Sebastian's hands clasped behind his back in a posture of rigid control, even as his voice betrayed the cost of maintaining that control for so many years, and he continued, "When I married you, I believed I was doing the honorable thing. Your father needed salvation from debt. I needed a duchess of appropriate birth and breeding. It was a practical arrangement that benefited both families, and I told myself that maintaining distance was the kindest approach, that it would spare you the burden of expectations I could not meet, spare you disappointment in a husband who had been trained since childhood to offer nothing of his heart. and he paused, his reflection ghostly in the window glass. And when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "I thought I was protecting you from the coldness I had inherited like a family heirloom. I thought keeping formal boundaries meant I was being honest about the limitations of what I could offer. I thought sparing you the burden of my regard was a form of kindness, when in truth it was only cowardice dressed in the costume of honor." And the words hung in the air between them like confession and accusation both, and Sebastian drew a breath that seemed to cost him something vital, and said, "I was wrong." And the admission was stark and simple and devastating, and he turned from the window at last to face her, his expression stripped of its usual careful neutrality, his eyes meeting hers with something raw and undefended, and he said, "I have been wrong for 10 years, Elara, wrong about what honor required, wrong about what kindness meant, wrong about everything except the one truth I was too afraid to speak." But before he could continue, before he could finally say the words that pressed against his chest like a physical weight, there came a sharp knock at the study door, and Thompson's urgent voice calling, "Your Grace, forgive the interruption, but there is a matter of extreme urgency. Lord Pemberton has arrived with the magistrate, and they insist on speaking with you immediately regarding the railway investment." And Sebastian closed his eyes briefly, as though in pain, and when he opened them, Elara could see the moment when he retreated back behind his walls, could see him reaching for the familiar armor of ducal authority, even as something in his expression begged her to wait, to give him time to finish what he had only just begun. Lord Pemberton proved to be merely the messenger of catastrophe, for behind him came Mr. Blackwell, the family solicitor, bearing ledgers and documents that painted a picture of systematic betrayal, and within the hour Sebastian's study had transformed into a war room where men in dark suits spoke in hushed, urgent tones about railway investments gone disastrously wrong, and a business partner named Cornelius Thorne, who had, it seemed, been systematically embezzling funds from the Ashford estate for the better part of 3 years, using Sebastian's name and reputation to secure loans that had never been invested as promised but had instead disappeared into Thorne's private accounts, and the scope of the theft was staggering nearly £30,000, enough to threaten the solvency of the entire estate, enough to destroy the Ashford name that had stood unblemished for generations. And Elara had withdrawn from the study when the men arrived, retreating to the drawing room, where she sat with hands folded in her lap and listened to the muffled voices rising and falling beyond the oak door, and she understood that whatever confession Sebastian had been about to make, whatever truth had been trembling on his lips, had been swallowed by this new crisis, postponed indefinitely by the demands of duty and disaster, and as the days unfolded, she watched him retreat completely into the role of Duke, saw him become once again the distant formal figure she had known for a decade, except now there was a haggardness to his features, a shadow beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible choices, and he took his meals in his study, worked through the night reviewing accounts and meeting with solicitors and magistrates, barely emerged, except to receive more bad news or issue more instructions, and Elara found herself wandering the corridors of Ashford Manor like a ghost again, invisible and unnecessary, except this time the invisibility chafed differently, because she had tasted the possibility of something more, and now watched it slip away beneath the weight of scandal and ruin, and she knew she should leave him to his crisis, knew she had no place in the masculine world of finance and law, knew her presence would only be a distraction. But on the 4th night, when she passed his study at 2 in the morning and saw lamplight still burning beneath the door, she could not simply walk past, and she entered without knocking to find him slumped over his desk, surrounded by ledgers and legal documents, his head in his hands, and when he looked up at her approach, his expression was so raw with exhaustion and despair that something in her chest cracked open, and she said quietly, "You cannot save the estate if you destroy yourself in the process." But he only shook his head and said, "If I cannot save it, then I have failed in the one duty that was truly mine. I will have proven my father right, that I was never worthy of this title." And the defeat in his voice was so complete that Elara made a decision in that moment, and she said, "Show me the accounts." And when he protested, she said more firmly, "Sebastian, show me the accounts. I may not have a head for railway investments, but I have managed this household for 10 years. I understand ledgers and patterns and where money should flow, and 2 pairs of eyes are better than one when searching for what the lawyers have missed." And perhaps it was exhaustion that made him acquiesce, or perhaps it was the memory of her standing in his study days earlier demanding honesty. But he gestured to the sprawling chaos of paperwork and said, "Then look, though I fear there is nothing to find except evidence of my own blindness." And Elara pulled a chair close to his desk and began to read. The pattern Elara had discovered revealed itself slowly over the following weeks as she and Sebastian worked side by side in his study. The room that had once been his exclusive domain now transformed into their shared war room, where ledgers sprawled across every surface and documents covered the Persian carpet in careful arrangement, and she found that her years of managing household accounts had given her an eye for discrepancies that the lawyers in their focus on large transactions had overlooked. For she noticed the small irregular payments, the quarterly disbursements that should have aligned with dividend schedules but were offset by weeks, the way certain expenses appeared in triplicate across different accounting books, as though someone had been deliberately creating confusion. And when she showed Sebastian her notations, he studied them with an intensity that made her aware of how close they sat, their shoulders nearly touching as they bent over the same page, and he said, "You see what I could not. You've found the thread we can pull to unravel Thorne's entire scheme." And there was wonder in his voice, mixed with something that might have been regret, and he added more quietly, "How did I not know you possessed this brilliance?" But before she could answer, he was already calling for Thompson to summon the solicitors, and the work consumed them both, days blending into nights as they traced the pattern she had found, following the thread of Thorne's deception through 3 years of accounts, until they had built a case so comprehensive that even the magistrate admitted it was unprecedented in its thoroughness. And during those long hours of collaboration, something shifted between them, not in any single dramatic moment, but in the accumulated weight of shared purpose. For they took their meals together now in the study, cold suppers eaten while discussing strategy. And Sebastian began asking her opinion not from politeness, but from genuine respect, would pause in his pacing to hear her thoughts on which approach might convince the railway board, or how to phrase a particular letter to investors. And she found herself offering ideas she would never have dared voice before, found him listening with an attention that made her feel truly seen, for perhaps the first time in their marriage. And sometimes when the work grew tedious, he would read aloud from correspondence to make her laugh at the pompous language certain lords employed, or she would offer a wry observation about human nature that would surprise from him an actual smile, and the servants noticed this transformation. Mrs. Hendricks remarking to Thompson that it was about time. His Grace recognized the treasure he had married, and one night, when they had worked past midnight, and exhaustion had made them both punchy with laughter over a particularly absurd legal document, Elara felt her eyes closing over the ledger before her and tried to fight the wave of sleep, but it pulled her under, despite her resistance, and she woke hours later being carried, and realized with a start that Sebastian held her in his arms, was carrying her through the darkened corridors of Ashford Manor with a gentleness that made her breath catch, and she kept her eyes closed, pretending still to sleep, because she wanted this moment to last, wanted to memorize the feeling of his arms around her and the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. And when he reached her chamber door, he hesitated there in the darkness, and she felt rather than saw him looking down at her face, felt the moment stretch and deepen into something profound, and she thought he might speak or perhaps lower his head to kiss her brow. But instead, he carried her inside and laid her carefully upon her bed, drawing the coverlet over her with hands that trembled slightly, and only when his footsteps had retreated did she open her eyes to stare at the ceiling and press her fingers to her lips, and wonder if transformation could truly be this simple, this quiet, this inevitable as spring following winter. The autumn had arrived again at Ashford Manor, and with it came a transformation of the grounds into a tapestry of amber and burgundy and gold, the ancient oaks that lined the long drive, shedding their leaves in slow spirals that reminded Elara of falling embers, and she stood at her chamber window watching the season turn, and thinking how strange it was that a year ago she had been invisible in this house, and now she found herself integral to its very functioning, for the crisis with Thorne had been resolved through their combined efforts. The embezzler arrested and the estate's finances slowly recovering, and in the months since they had continued working together, not from necessity but from choice, Sebastian seeking her counsel on matters great and small, their partnership extending beyond ledgers into genuine collaboration, on everything from tenant concerns to agricultural improvements, and yet, for all this companionship, he had not returned to that moment in his study when he had begun to confess something before Pemberton's arrival, and had not spoken of feelings or acknowledged what had shifted between them beyond professional respect, and Elara found herself suspended in a peculiar limbo where she was no longer invisible but not quite seen in the way her heart desired. And so when Sebastian appeared at the breakfast room that morning and asked with unusual formality if she would walk with him through the estate grounds, she felt her pulse quicken with something between hope and trepidation, and she agreed, though her hands trembled slightly as she retrieved her shawl and bonnet, and they set out together through the gardens she had tended for a decade, past the rose beds, now preparing for winter sleep, and the reflecting pool where fallen leaves floated like small boats, and they walked in silence that felt companionable rather than awkward, until Sebastian led her beyond the formal gardens to the wilder edges of the estate, where an ancient oak tree stood solitary and magnificent, its gnarled trunk testament to centuries of weathering storms. And there he stopped and turned to face her with an expression so serious that her breath caught in her throat, and he said, "Do you remember when I said I've always cared?" And she nodded, because of course she remembered that night in the carriage, when those 3 words had hung between them like a promise unfulfilled, and he continued in a voice that shook despite his evident effort at control. "I spoke incomplete truth that night. Elara and I have carried the weight of that incompleteness for months now, and afraid, as I have always been afraid, but I find I cannot continue in this half-truth any longer." And she noticed he had used her name, the first time he had spoken it aloud since that feverish confession weeks ago, and the sound of it on his lips made something in her chest expand painfully, and he said more quietly now, as though the words were being pulled from some deep well within him, "I have not merely cared, I have loved you, Elara, loved you almost from the beginning, though I was too much a coward to acknowledge it, even to myself, too trapped in my father's teachings that emotion was weakness, and too afraid of the vulnerability that love demands, and so I built walls between us and called it honor when it was only fear, and I have wasted 10 years of our lives because I was too proud to risk rejection, too certain that you could never care for a man who had treated you with such coldness." And the confession hung in the autumn air between them, while leaves continued their gentle descent around them like benediction. Elara stood beneath the ancient oak with Sebastian's confession still hanging in the autumn air between them, and she felt the warring of emotions within her chest like a tempest contained in too fragile a vessel, for there was joy. Yes, at hearing him speak her name with such tenderness, and at learning that he had loved her all these years. But alongside that joy rose anger, hot and righteous at the waste of it all, at 10 years of loneliness endured because he had been too afraid to speak. And beneath both joy and anger lay a grief so profound it threatened to break her, grief for the young bride she had been, who had hoped for affection and learned instead to expect nothing, grief for all the mornings she had woken alone and all the evenings she had retired to empty chambers while he stood behind his closed door. And she realized that he was waiting for her to speak, his face pale and tense with the vulnerability of his confession, and she found her voice, though it trembled with the force of everything she felt, and said, "You have my name now, you've said it at last, but Sebastian." And she saw him flinch slightly at the sound of his own name on her lips, as though he had not expected her to claim that same intimacy, and she continued, because the words needed to be spoken, even if they caused pain. 10 years is a long time to be invisible, 10 years of loneliness because you were afraid, and I understand fear. I have lived with my own fears all this time, but understanding does not erase the years or heal the wounds they left. And her voice broke, despite her effort to keep it steady, and she felt tears beginning to blur her vision, though she fought them back, because she would not let this moment dissolve into weeping when there were truths that needed acknowledging, and she said more quietly now, almost to herself as much as to him, "I don't know if I can simply forgive and forget. I don't know if hearing that you loved me all along makes the loneliness retroactively bearable, or if it only makes it more painful to know it was unnecessary, that we could have had something real instead of this decade of careful distance." And she watched him absorb her words, saw the pain that crossed his features, and the way his hands clenched at his sides, as though he wanted to reach for her, but knew he had forfeited that right. and he said with a humility she had never heard from him before, "I don't ask for forgiveness I haven't earned. Elara, I don't expect you to absolve me of the hurt I've caused through my cowardice. I ask only for the chance to spend the next 10 years, the next 50 if you'll grant them to me, proving that my love is real and not merely words spoken too late." And there was such naked honesty in his voice, such complete absence of the pride that had always armored him, that she felt something shift within her own guarded heart. Not forgiveness, perhaps, not yet, but the possibility of it, the recognition that transformation required not just confession, but time and patience, and the slow rebuilding of trust that had never truly existed between them. Winter arrived at Ashford Manor with its customary severity, the grounds transforming beneath blankets of snow that softened the hard edges of the landscape, and muffled sound until the world seemed wrapped in contemplative silence. And in this season of quietude, Elara and Sebastian began the slow, careful work of building something they had never possessed in 11 years of marriage. Not passion or grand romance, but something perhaps more essential, the foundation of genuine friendship upon which love might eventually rest, secure. And they did not rush toward intimacy, but instead took tentative steps like travelers learning unfamiliar terrain, beginning with breakfast together each morning in the smaller dining room rather than the formal hall, where Sebastian would ask about her plans for the day and actually listen to her answers rather than offering the polite half-attention that had characterized their previous exchanges. And she found herself sharing thoughts she had kept private for years, her concerns about the tenant families struggling through the harsh winter, her ideas for improving the estate's charitable works, her observations about literature and music, and the small philosophical wonderings that had occupied her solitary hours. And he valued her input not with patronizing indulgence, but with genuine respect, often asking her to elaborate or offering his own perspectives that revealed depths she had not suspected beneath his formal exterior. And they discovered shared interests that surprised them both, a mutual love of poetry, particularly the metaphysical poets, whose complex imagery spoke to both their natures, an appreciation for chamber music that led to evenings in the music room where she would play while he turned pages, a commitment to social reform that had them debating late into the night about tenant welfare and workers' rights and the responsibilities of their class. And gradually small touches became natural between them, his hand settling briefly at her back as they walked through the portrait gallery, her fingers brushing his when she passed him his coffee cup. Moments of physical contact that no longer carried the electric shock of novelty, but instead the gentle warmth of growing comfort. And one snowy evening when the wind howled against the manor's windows and the fire burned low in the library hearth, Sebastian settled into the chair beside hers and began reading poetry aloud, his voice low and measured as he worked through Donne's verses while she sat with her embroidery, creating a scene of such peaceful domesticity that Elara felt something in her chest expand with tentative joy, for this was what she had imagined. Marriage might be all those years ago when she was 19 and foolishly hopeful. This companionship and quiet sharing of space, and she realized that her guarded heart was slowly, carefully opening, despite her efforts to protect it, that forgiveness was creeping in, not as a conscious decision, but as the natural result of his consistent presence and evident effort, his patience in not demanding more than she could give, his willingness to earn rather than expect her trust. And when he glanced up from his reading to find her watching him, and smiled with a tenderness that transformed his usually stern features, she thought perhaps healing was possible after all. Perhaps the next 10 years could indeed be different from the previous decade. Perhaps it was not too late for them to become what they should have been from the beginning. Spring returned to Ashford Manor with its promise of renewal, and with it came preparations for the annual ball that marked exactly 11 years since Elara and Sebastian had spoken their wedding vows in the chapel that overlooked these same grounds, though this year the anniversary held different weight than all the ones that had preceded it, for something had shifted fundamentally between them during the long winter months of companionship and careful trust-building. And as Elara stood in her chambers that evening, while her lady's maid fastened the emerald silk gown that brought out the green depths of her eyes, she felt a flutter of anticipation rather than the resigned duty that had characterized previous social events. And when she descended the grand staircase with one gloved hand trailing along the banister she had touched countless times before, She saw Sebastian waiting at the bottom in his formal evening attire, his dark hair gleaming in the candlelight, and his grey eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. And as she reached the final step, he extended his hand to help her down, and when her fingers settled in his palm, he raised her hand to his lips and said in a voice that carried clearly through the assembled servants and early arriving guests, "You are breathtaking, Elara." And it was the first time he had ever spoken her name in company, the first time he had publicly claimed her as more than a duchess or a convenient arrangement, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks as she met his gaze and saw such open tenderness there that her heart seemed to expand beyond the capacity of her chest, and the ball itself passed in a blur of dancing and conversation, where Sebastian remained at her side rather than retreating to the card room or his study, where he introduced her not as the Duchess but as "my wife, Elara," where his hand found the small of her back with easy familiarity as they moved through the crowded rooms, and when the last guest finally departed in the small hours of morning and the servants began extinguishing candles and clearing glasses, they found themselves alone in the emptied ballroom with only a few remaining tapers casting golden light across the polished floor. And Sebastian turned to her and said softly, "Dance with me?" Though there was no orchestra now, no music except the distant sound of wind in the eaves, and she stepped into his arms as naturally as breathing, and they swayed together in the silence, while he whispered her name again and again like a prayer or an incantation, "Elara, Elara, my Elara," making up for all the years he had denied himself the sound of it, and when he finally lowered his head to kiss her, it was their first real kiss in 11 years of marriage, tender and searching and flavored with salt, because tears were sliding down both their faces, tears for the wasted years and the found present and the hopeful future, and when they finally drew apart, she rested her forehead against his and whispered, "Say it again," and he smiled against her hair and obliged, speaking her name into the darkness like the most precious word he knew. 5 years had passed since that spring ball when Sebastian first spoke Elara's name before witnesses, and Ashford Manor had transformed from a mausoleum of formality into something alive and warm, its corridors now echoing with children's laughter instead of hollow silence. And on this particular autumn morning, Elara woke to sunlight streaming through windows she now shared with her husband, his arm draped across her waist in sleep, and she studied his face in repose, thinking how the stern lines had softened over these years of happiness, how he smiled more readily now, how the grey eyes that once regarded her with polite distance now lit with unmistakable devotion whenever they found her across a room, and when he stirred and opened those eyes and murmured, "Good morning, Elara, my love," in the rough voice of new waking, she felt the same flutter of joy she had experienced countless mornings before, for he never tired of speaking her name, seemed to find sustenance in the sound of it, as if making up for all those years of Duchess and Madam, and their breakfast was shared in the sunny morning room with their 3 children, Margaret, who was 4 with her mother's auburn hair, Thomas, who was 2 with his father's serious expression, and baby Catherine sleeping in her cradle nearby, and Sebastian listened attentively as Margaret chatted about the kittens in the stable, while his hand found Elara's beneath the table and squeezed gently, a gesture of connection that had become natural as breathing, and later, when the children were with their governess, Elara worked alongside Sebastian in the study, reviewing estate matters, her opinions not merely tolerated but actively sought, her intelligence finally recognized and valued, and in the afternoon they walked together through the rose garden that had once been her solitary refuge, and he stole a kiss among the blooms, making her laugh and swat his shoulder playfully, and that evening, as the sun set gold and crimson over the grounds, they stood at the nursery window, watching their children play on the lawn below, his arm around her shoulders and her head resting against his chest, and she thought how she had bloomed from invisible duchess into cherished wife and partner, how her presence had become essential rather than ornamental, how the manor that had once felt like a beautiful prison now felt like home, and Sebastian pressed a kiss to her temple and whispered, "I love you, Elara," for perhaps the 100th time that day, and she smiled because she would never tire of hearing it, those words and her name spoken together like a benediction. Dear listener, you might think this a simple romance, a tale of misunderstanding resolved and happiness achieved, but it speaks to a deeper truth that resonates beyond the walls of Ashford Manor and the particular lives of a duke and duchess in the English countryside. For how many of us remain invisible because someone lacks the courage to truly see us? How many of us build walls from fear only to discover that vulnerability is not weakness, but the greatest strength? How many precious years do we waste protecting ourselves from the very connection our hearts most desperately need? And sometimes the most profound love stories are not about finding someone new, but finally seeing who was always there, standing patient and dignified in the shadows of our own making, waiting not with demands but with quiet hope that we might eventually find the courage to speak their name with tenderness, to acknowledge their worth, to choose love over pride and connection over self-protection. May you have the courage to tear down walls built from fear and to understand that it is never too late to choose differently, never too late to speak a name you should have been saying all along, never too late to see the person who has been waiting in plain sight for your recognition. May your heart find peace in both patience and honesty, in the slow, careful work of building trust and the bold declaration of feeling too long suppressed. From Tales of Heart and Home, may your own story be filled with names spoken softly in morning light and love declared boldly before witnesses, with the transformation that comes from finally choosing to see and be seen. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs reminding that transformation is always possible, that wasted years need not define the years to come, that it is never too late for walls to crumble and for love finally acknowledged to flourish. Subscribe for more tales that honor both the pain of loneliness endured and the redemption of love finally, bravely, completely embraced.